This is Viva Fry.
I'm Dr. Peter McCullough.
This is Tom Luongo.
This is Chuck Prodnick.
This is Alex Kreiner.
Hey, this is Brad Wall.
This is JP Sears.
Hi, this is Frank Peretti.
This is Tammy Peterson.
This is Danielle Smith.
This is James Lindsay.
Hey, this is Brett Kissel, and you're listening to the Shaun Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. How's everybody doing today? Happy Tuesday. Did you know that you can hold physical gold and silver in your registered accounts? Silver Gold Bull SGB can help you unlock the potential of your RRSP, TFSA, RRIF, or Kids RESP by adding physical and gold. Oh man, by adding physical gold and silver to your account. Oh my goodness. This year's RRSP deadline for making contributions is February 29th, but once a contribution is made, you can invest into physical precious metals at any time. My tongue is not working. Silver Gold Bull is the company I recommend to family and friends and interested in precious metals, and they can help you with their in-house solutions, whether buying, selling, storing, or Hello Tuesday. Is this a Monday? We on Monday right now? Oh boy. They can help you with their in-house solutions, whether buying, selling, or storing precious metals. Shouldn't be that hard, Shaun. Text or email Grahame for details or with any questions you have around investing in precious metals and for the feature silver deals exclusively offered to SNP listeners. If you're buying anything from SGB, just make sure to reference the SNP RecTech for over 20 years. Man, this could be a long couple of minutes here, folks. For over 20 years, RecTech Power Products have been committed to excellence in the power sports industry. They are a landmark here in Lloydminster, as some listeners would say when they're driving through the bustling metropolis of Lloydminster. And they have a ton of stuff. I was telling you over the holidays we were out at Al's, and he let the kids hop in one of the Defenders, a little side-by-side action, and it was something, all right. And we got to test drive that sucker. And if you want to test drive some things, you should just reach out to Ryan, the manager there, tell him I sent you. Or just stop in on the west side of town. See the showroom. They got everything. I mean, we're a little ways away from the golf season. But, days are getting a little bit longer every day, folks. And they got everything from golf carts to snowmobiles to quads to lawnmowers to trailers and on and on and on it goes. Boats, Lund boats, I might add, thrown in there. So if you're interested, make sure you stop in and see the boys over at RecTech. You can also, they're open Monday through Saturday, and you can also look up everything on rectechpowerproducts.com. Ignite Distribution out of Wainwright, Alberta. Our good old friend to the south of us here in Lloydminster, Shane Stafford. He can supply industrial safety, welding, automotive parts. He's got on-site inventory management, and he will make sure you never run out of all the things that make your business tick along. That's Shane Stafford, 780-842-3433. Give Shane a call. Tell him I sent you. Substack, free to subscribe to. I've been asking a lot about what people want to see in the paid subscriber portion of Substack. What do you want as bonus? What do you guys want? And a couple of the things that's come out. One has been, the ability to maybe submit a question to, if you got, Daniel Smith or I don't know, even Chuck Prodnick, right? Like the spectrum, Chris Sims, and on and on and on. If people knew the guests were coming on, so like early access to who's coming on, and then the ability to maybe to ask a question or two, that's been one of them. Another one's been, if I'm heading to Calgary, maybe for paid subscribers, throwing out a location and having a little community, soiree, meeting, get together, throw out a word. And maybe you have some different ideas out there that you would like to see happen on the show or with the show. And if you're not subscribed to the Substack, you really should. It is free to subscribe. Get a weekend review every Sunday night at 5. And then obviously there's a paid portion for people who want to support the podcast. And we're just trying to work out some things here in 2025 to make it, as valuable as possible to all of you that you want to get in on it. So you just tell me what you want to see, and I can't guarantee everything, but certainly we can have a little bit of fun. That's what it's all about. Cornerstone Forum 2025 is heading to Calgary, Alberta on May 10th. And we got hotels all lined up. We got the Cornerstone Expo, so you can go on the latest Substack post. And if you're a business owner, it's quite, honestly, it's worth taking a look at. Small or large business, wherever you sit, there's the opportunity to have your business showcased at the Cornerstone Forum. And then, of course, we got an excellent lineup of guests. Martin Armstrong going to be in person this year, bringing back Tom Luongo, Alex Craner, Chuck Prodnick, newcomers Kalen Ford, Chase Barber, Matt Arrett, Ben Perrin, Rod Giltaka, Vince Lanchi, guest hosts including Chris Sims and Tom Bodrovics. It's going to be a ton of fun. Tickets down in the show notes. If you're listening or watching on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Rumble, make sure to subscribe. And if you want, leave a review. All this helps. Truly, it does. And if you're watching on X, yes, you, make sure to retweet it. Let's get it a little further than what it currently is and to a bigger audience. All right. Let's get on the tail of the tape. He's an American author and podcast host who started back in 2005. I'm talking about Derek Gilbert. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Shaun Newman Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Derek Gilbert. Sir, thanks for hopping back on.
I appreciate it. Always enjoy talking with you, Shaun.
Well, the only time you've been on this side was episode 701. So if people are scrambling and going, who is this guy? And you want to go back and listen to your early podcasting story circa 2005 and figuring out the ins and outs of how that worked, go back to episode 701 before you proceed any further. If you want to sit and have a chat with me and Derek about 2025 and who knows where we go, then carry on, folks. But appreciate you giving me some time and hopping back on. The thing that jumped out to me when you talk about it's 20 years this year of podcasting, correct?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's think about that, folks. That's a lot of years. And I mean that with the utmost respect. It's just most people don't stick around any field for that long, they bounce from here to there. And I go 20 years of podcasting, talking about things, staring at problems, talking about them, seeing the trends and everything. I'm like, I bet you Derek has some interesting insights or at least perspective on the year to come and where we've come from. So I was just like, let's just start 2025. We're in the early days of it. You got Trump getting inaugurated here on January 20th, sitting where I sit in Canada. We got a prime minister who intends to resign, but has set in motion, an election coming sooner than later. What do you see in 2025?
There are a lot of things, moving pieces. It looks to us, and I say us because Sharon is the smarter half of the
next time, Sharon, you're here. Coming on. Yes.
Yeah, she just goes to bed really early is the only problem. So, which means, by the way, if you see our dogs run in and out of the room, it's because they're basically fending for themselves during the time that we're talking here this afternoon. So we may get some dog wrestling in the background. We've been looking at things since March of 2025. I mean, we were early enough in the game that was back when Apple was still begging people, hey, submit your podcast so we can put some things in our iTunes store. And this was back when they called it the podcast because the iPod was still a thing. So we've been doing this a while, but we're news junkies. And so this is something that comes kind of naturally to it. We'd be doing this anyway, even if we were just sharing our opinions with, megaphones from our back deck. But when we're looking at 2025, we see a lot of things that are coalescing. And Sharon said back in 2020, during the presidential campaign here in the States, that she felt Joe Biden was perhaps being put into office, and I'll just leave it at that, to get the United States embroiled in World War III, and then hand that off to somebody else who then have to clean up that mess. Given that he just today, as we're recording this, shoveled another $500 million of military aid to Ukraine out the door on his way out of the White House, I'm thinking that she may have been right about this for the last 4 years, that Joe Biden's term was intended to get the United States embroiled in some things that will be very difficult to extricate from. War is a racket. The famed Marine Corps General Smedley Butler wrote that back 100 years ago after having led Marines into action in, and I'm not sure where it was in the Caribbean, but he come to realize that he was working on behalf or fighting on behalf of oligarchs rather than the American people. That's what's going on in Ukraine. We are involved in that proxy war between NATO and Russia in all but name. And the Russians have said so. We have given Ukraine permission to use our long-range ATACMS missiles, just as the Brits have done with their Storm Shadow missiles. The French have done it with their long-range missiles, to launch deep into Russia. And Russia said, look, if you do this, you are an active participant in this war. Where does this lead? Thankfully, Russia has not chosen to launch presumably the hypersonic missiles that they demonstrated at that one strike in Western Ukraine on Western capitals like Berlin, Paris, or London. And maybe there's some back-channel communication taking place between Trump and Putin to say, just hold on a few more weeks. I hope cooler heads prevail, because I don't see anyone really coming out of this ahead other than those who are selling the weapons to the militaries that are being flung back and forth. So will 2025 be the end of the war between Ukraine and Russia? I certainly hope so, for the people of Ukraine, if for nothing else. I mean, Biden and his handlers have been trying to get the Ukrainians to lower the conscription age from 25 to 18. I mean, in Ukraine, you can only be conscripted into the army if you're 25 or older. It's because they want to have enough young men to create new Ukrainians. You know, you can't make new Ukrainians if you're sending all your young men off to war. So they've resisted this call to this point. But I think this is just really chilling when you think about it. It appears as though the Western world, led by the United States, is willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. We're willing to keep this belligerent attitude towards Russia as long as the Ukrainians are willing to put up with it. And I hope that in 2025 that comes to an end. But while this is going on there, you've got the Middle East, which is still unsettled, to say the least. The fall of Bashar al-Assad in December was kind of unexpected, but I think it wasn't really for the intelligence communities, the intelligence professionals who've been watching things closely there. The so-called land bridge between Iran and Lebanon, the Shia crescent that Russia had been cultivating for a long, long time, decades, to connect Iran through Iraq and Syria to the majority Shia population of Lebanon, was very nearly complete, despite the fact that there are still American boots on the ground in Iraq and in Syria. The Iranians were transporting weapons on a regular basis through Syria and into Lebanon. The Israelis were trying to stop that by hitting some of the border crossings, but suddenly, in December, this Sunni rebel group swept down from the northwestern province of Idlib and took Damascus. So now you've got Syria chopped up into four major zones. You've got the small Alawite enclave along the Mediterranean. The Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. Syria is majority Sunni, but it's been ruled by Assad, who was an Alawite, the Assad family for decades. So the Sunnis now control the center of the country, including Damascus, the capital. You've got the Kurds, who are Sunni Muslims, but they are ethnically distinct from Arabs and Turks and Persians, and none of them like each other, which is a whole nother dynamic. And then in the south, you've got the Druze. And the Druze are another offshoot of Shia Islam, although they don't identify as Muslim. They've got a very secretive religion. They venerate Moses' father-in-law Jethro as a prophet. But they've been loyal citizens of whatever country they happen to be a part of. Well, the Druze are split between Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, and the Druze have made it clear that they would just as soon be assimilated into an expanded Israeli state. There are 6 Druze villages along the border with the Golan Heights. They've asked to be annexed by Israel. And then in Suwaida province, which is the very southernmost part of Syria, the Druze there have asked the Israelis to extend their borders and assimilate them. Well, okay, except that they'd have to also then get through a big Sunni enclave in the southern part of Syria. So that is an issue that's got to be resolved. It's just the Druze don't want to live under Sharia law. And even though the Sunni rebels who've taken over Damascus are now wearing business suits instead of, fatigues, they're still wanting to impose Sharia on anyone who's not a Sunni Muslim. Then the eastern part of the country controlled by the Kurds, everything east of the Euphrates is basically Kurdish. So how is this going to affect things? Well, when you go back to 2011, and again, this is where our long stretch of podcasting is handy. I remember when this Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, it was for control. That's the puppy Glory. She's challenging the older one, Grace.
If you go back to 701, folks, the same thing happened.
Yeah. It's hi, Glory. Yep. Hi, Grace. Okay, down. Thank you. We referred to Syria back then, and there were others who did as well, as Pipelineistan, because this appears to be flaring up again now that the Sunnis are in control of the central part of the country, and the government of Qatar has said, well, we'll kick in some cash to help increase the salaries of the civil workers and the government employees in Syria, trying to buy some favor there. Why would they do that? Because there's a lot of natural gas on both sides of the Persian Gulf. On the west side, you've got Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and they would like to ship this natural gas via pipelines to Europe by way of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria, and then through Turkey, also Sunni Muslim, and then on to Europe. The east side of the Persian Gulf is Iran. Iran would like to send its natural gas to Europe by way of Iraq, which is majority Shia, like Iran, through Syria, and then via tanker from Syria directly to Europe, cutting Turkey out of the equation, and of course, cutting Qatar and Saudi Arabia out of it. So this is what's been going on since 2011. The fight, the civil war there, is for control of Syria, which is the key component in these two competing pipeline plans. So, just as the war in Iraq going back to, the first Gulf War, it's all about the oil. Well, in this case, it's all about the gas. And some oil, because the main Syrian oil fields are in the eastern part of the country under the control of the Kurds. While this is going on, the United States military this past week, even though the Pentagon denies it, has just started building a new military base near the city of Kobani, which is a Kurdish city right on the border between Syria and Turkey. Now, the Turks, they don't like the Kurds at all. And Turkey's President Erdogan has said that he doesn't want a future Syria to have any Kurds in it at all. Again, remember, everything in Syria east of the Euphrates is under control of Kurdish-backed groups. There are a lot of Kurds in northern Iraq. Southeastern Turkey is mainly Kurdish. A lot of Kurds in northwestern Iran, too. When the Brits and the French divided up Mesopotamia after World War I, they left the 20 million Kurds out of the equation. They were the largest ethnic group on earth, and they are still to this day, the largest ethnic group on earth without its own country. The Kurds split between four nations, and none of those four nations particularly like the Kurds.
Why is that?
I just think the Westerners, the Brits and the French, were like, okay, let's draw lines on a map. Where are the oil fields? Because even going back to 1917, that was beginning to become a calculation. So when you're looking at how things
why can they be the largest ethnic group on the planet? Hasn't nobody been able to unite the Kurds and be like, we want our own?
Well, yeah, you've got the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, which has been designated a terrorist organization by the United States Department of State. So the U.S. government and the Turkish government considers those Kurds terrorists. But when you cross the border into Syria, the YPG, they're fine. They're our allies. They fight alongside the U.S. soldiers that are on the ground in Syria. As though there's something magical about that border between Syria and Turkey that cleanses the YPG of all the sins that have been ascribed to the PKK. I'm not an expert on Kurdish relations, and there are political factions within the Kurds, just as there are within every organization.
What's their history, Derek? Do you know how, like, where they stem from, if you would? Like, where do the Kurds come from? Like, what's their ancestry?
Well, there are those who believe, because they seem to originate in northwestern Iran, and that seems to be the region that was dominated in, say, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the Medes. So when you talk about the Medo-Persian Empire, which was created by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, when Cyrus, because up to that point, the Medes had dominated the Persians. When Cyrus came to power as the king of the Persians, I'm not going to pronounce it right, the Achaemenid Empire, he's the one who founded the Achaemenid dynasty. He overthrew the Medes as their overlords and then inherited all of the territory that they controlled, which at that point was everything from northwestern Iran to northern Iraq over into what is most of now Turkey today. That was all part of the Median Empire. I think there are those who believe that the Kurds are descended from the Medes.
Just seems, I don't know. Doesn't it seem strange that the largest ethnic group on the planet
came out of World War I without a country?
Yeah, and I like to think, it has to do only with oil fields. But I'm like, that's making it almost too simple. And at times, simple explanations are the answer. But when it comes to the Brits and the Americans and on and on and on, there's lots of times when they don't want certain things to be ever put back together. And you think if they're the largest, if they're the largest ethnic group without a country, it just seems odd. That seems like something to stare at and go, why is that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because right now, today, it's estimated that there are between 30 and 45 million Kurds, again, divided between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And they just kind of straddle those borders there. And why they don't have their own country, I don't know. I mean, it could go back 100 years to maybe not having a seat at the table when things were being negotiated. After World War I, it's possible the Kurds didn't want to collaborate with the Brits in trying to overthrow the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The Arabs were, the whole point of the movie Lawrence of Arabia was that the Brits managed to talk the Arabs into going to war against the Turks to basically attack the southern flank of the Axis powers in World War I, because the Ottomans were allied with Austria-Hungary and Germany in World War I. So that created problems, diverted resources that the Ottomans could have been using to help the Germans and the Austrians fight against the Italians and the French and the Brits and eventually the Americans. The Kurds, I don't know. I haven't done enough study as to what happened 100 years ago, but when those lines got drawn on the map, the Kurds were just left out. And those lines are really arbitrary anyway, because the Arabs are just as tribal as the ancient Israelites were. And there are factions within the Arabs between various tribes, not to mention religions. You got some that are Shia, majority are Sunni, but then various tribes don't like each other. And the idea, going back to George W. Bush, he ran on a promise of not nation building. And then, of course, he broke that promise as soon as, like the day after 9/11. And we went into Afghanistan and went into Iraq in 2003. And we've been there ever since, trying to build a nation. The idea that we could ever impose a Western-style representative republic or democracy on a tribal people like the Arabs was just foolish. And either the people who made those decisions were just ignorant of Middle Eastern history and culture, or they just knew going in it wasn't going to work, but didn't care because they were doing this for control of the oil resources.
When you look at Donald Trump, what do you see? I'm curious. He's been obviously president from 2016, 2020, and then as you've alluded to, maybe some tomfoolery happens in 2020, and you get Biden. But now you got Donald Trump elected to be inaugurated on January 20th. Where do you sit on Donald Trump? And in the last little bit, talking about taking over Canada, talking about taking over Greenland, has his son fly to Greenland. Like, what is going on? Gulf of Mexico, going to be Gulf of America, and on and on. Trump, in comes the years of Donald Trump.
A friend of ours in 2016 said the day after the election, well, we don't know if Trump's going to be a good president, but at least it'll be hilarious. And I think that holds true again in 2024, 2025. I think as a businessman, he says things that throw people off balance as a negotiating tactic. Because if you got him on the back foot when you sit down to negotiate, you've almost already won whatever you're trying to negotiate. I don't honestly think Trump wants Canada as the 51st American state. Now, I think if we could take Alberta and the oil resources there, we'd be happy to do it, but we'd like to trade you California, Oregon, and Washington in exchange. I say that as a conservative from the Midwest. There are a lot of good people out on the West Coast that we know, so I'm just joking. But I think Trump is likewise joking. We're going to impose a 25% tariff on Canada. Okay. I don't think he's really going to do it, but I think it puts Canadian politicians on, like, whoa, because there's a lot of stuff that we import from Canada, energy products, steel. I know there's some steel and steel pipe that we bring in from Canada, and I'm sure those industries would like to not have to pay that 25% tariff. I don't think it'll come to that, but I think that's an opening salvo in what will become a negotiation over whatever Trump wants to get out of Canada. Likewise with Mexico, I think he's just trying to put the Mexican government on a back foot and try to get better cooperation with the government of Mexico over stemming the flood of migrants. By some accounts, we've seen as many as 11 million undocumented migrants cross our border since Joe Biden took office. And many of these people are not from Central or South America. They're from Africa. They're from the Middle East. They're from China. And that by any stretch, any description is an invasion. So if he's going to get cooperation from Mexico, he comes in talking tough and then backs off. Now, when it comes to Greenland, we've got a very important military base there. Denmark has allowed Greenland to essentially self-govern. I think 50,000 people on Greenland. But Greenland's got a lot of oil, and by some accounts, there are a lot of rare earth metals. In fact, the second largest deposits of rare earth metals, which are key to running all of these electronics that we use to communicate, like the way we are right now, to those controlled by China, between China proper and Chinese mines in Africa. So, yeah, if the United States could cut a favorable deal, at the very least, with the government of Denmark for access to those, not to mention the fact we've got a very important air base there in Greenland, and also radar installations for early warnings about missiles coming over the North Pole. Again, I think Trump is saying things that are outrageous just to throw people off their game, and then he's going to negotiate for the best possible deal. Will he succeed as president? I don't know. I think one of the things that caught him by surprise was the depth of the deep state when he had his first term. But he's had 4 years now to think about what happened and what he might do differently this time around, and also to vet potential allies and members of his cabinet and his staff this time around. I read a book over the summer which was really eye-opening. It's called The Secret War Against the Jews. It's eye-opening for a couple of reasons. One is because you realize when you read that book, and the authors, one was a former prosecutor for the Department of Justice here in the United States who was tasked with tracking down Nazis who'd escaped justice at Nuremberg, who had found refuge here in the United States. Another was an investigative journalist from Australia, and they spent several years digging through files at the Department of Justice, but also talking to retired members of various intelligence agencies in the U.S., the U.K., France, Germany, and Israel, and found that contrary to what many people believe, that the Israeli lobby really controls the United States government, it's the other way around. The government of Israel is really beholden and has to walk very carefully because it's survival depends on maintaining a good relationship with the United States of America. And this really does come down to oil. Going back to 1930, when they began to find oil in Bahrain and then Kuwait and then Saudi Arabia, suddenly there was a lot of money to be made making deals with the Arabs. The Israelis, no oil. So who cares about the Zionists? Who cares about the Jews? But the other very interesting detail, the takeaway from that book, is how little control presidents of the United States have over the governments that they lead. Because you find out when reading that book that presidents like Roosevelt and Truman, who were favorably disposed to the aspirations of the Zionists, were being circumvented. They were being undercut by members of their intelligence agencies who were working on behalf of Standard Oil of New Jersey and Texaco and Exxon and Mobil, because there was, in fact, to the point that Standard of New Jersey actually blackmailed the United States government during World War II. You're investigating us for selling oil to Germany through Spain. If you continue this line of investigation, we might interrupt the flow of oil from Arabia to the United States. This was during the middle of World War II. So Roosevelt had to back down. Jimmy Carter, who just passed, he was just laid to rest today as we're recording this here, the 38th president of the United States. His legacy is basically brokering a peace between Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel. But Carter was rather naive, and his intelligence agencies basically didn't tell him what they didn't want him to know. So the question is then, does Trump have a better handle on what his intelligence agencies are doing? I mean, Chuck Schumer warned about this back 4 years ago. Trump made some comment, and Schumer said irritating the intelligence agencies is a bad idea because they've got, how did he put it? He messed up the metaphor, but he said 7 ways to Sunday they can blank you over. And I think that's absolutely true. I think there are factions within any government that are operating and doing things that the head of state doesn't necessarily know about. So will Trump be a successful president in his second term? I don't know, because I don't know how deep the deep state goes. I'm not an expert on what happens behind the scenes with the intelligence communities or what levers of power they can bring to bear against Trump if he tries to do something that they don't want.
You said something there that caught my ear. And you said that it's not Israel that controls the United States. It's the United States that controls Israel. One of the big things going around right now is that Israel, basically controls the United States.
Yep.
That it is that dual citizens, that government officials have, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong in any shape or form, Derek, but like AIPAC members that are basically assigned to them, and that, Israel's the one pulling the strings. But you just said the complete opposite of that.
Yep.
So expand on that thought for me.
Again, it comes down to the oil. Who's got the money? Who can make money in the Middle East, and what do they do to make that money? Israel's got a tech sector that is very robust, and I think that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sees some benefit to working with Israel, because Israel and Iran are certainly enemies, and the Sunnis and the Shias hate each other even more than they hate Jews, Hindus, and Christians. So for MBS, Israel is the enemy of my enemy, who that therefore makes my friend. But when it comes right down to the coin of the realm, as much as the environmentalists would like to change it, the fact remains that oil is still the coin of the realm. And the Arabs have the oil, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Jews do not. So that is just a simple fact, and I think that spinning of the relationship between AIPAC and the United States government to portray the United States government as beholden to the Jews is just a fundamental misreading of the true situation on the ground in Israel. The Israelis understand that without the United States, they would be dead. And so the United States has a lot more clout with Israel than the other way around.
That's I find that, well, I mean, just once again, your perspective, I find that interesting because the going, and once again, I go, is it the going trend or is it just what is being fed on Twitter? And once again, but the thing I'm picking up and seeing is the idea that Israel is the I don't know, the controlling force of the world power, and that Mossad has been a part of a lot of different things, from possibly Epstein Island to, I mean, I don't know how far you want to go back, but definitely had their intelligence agency involved in a lot, and that they've compromised a lot of American politicians. I guess that's the way my brain perceives what's being put out there.
And that's not necessarily wrong. One of the things that you come away from the secret war against the Jews, and the authors John Loftus and Mark Ahrens, who've done some just fabulous research in that book, published in 1994. It was actually a New York Times bestseller back then, but it's kind of dropped off the radar because it presents a contrary narrative to what most people want to believe. David Ben-Gurion, back in 1947, when the United Nations was getting ready to vote to approve something that had been promised to the Zionists for 30 years, since 1917, with the Balfour Declaration. But that was also encoded into the League of Nations Charter in 1920. So, I mean, people will point to the Balfour Declaration and say, well, because this was given to Lord Rothschild in England, because he was a leader of the Jewish community there. Therefore, the Rothschild and the Rothschild banking dynasty were the ones who put this all together. No, really, when you look at the fortunes of the Rothschild banking, they're still rich. There's no question there. But they're not even, they're small potatoes when it comes to the international bankers. And they did not do well between World War I and World War II because, again, the money to be made was by cutting deals with the Arabs. So Ben-Gurion essentially had to use information collected from Jewish intelligence officers working for UK intelligence, for American intelligence, even German intelligence, and go to Stalin and say, look, we know who your agents are inside this new CIA that the United States has. We'll keep quiet about it if you will get the Soviet bloc to vote in favor of creating an independent Jewish state in Palestine. And so Stalin bit his lip because he hated the Jews, and he did. And then they had to go to Nelson Rockefeller, who was later the governor of New York State and the vice president of the United States, and say, Mr. Rockefeller, we know you were doing business with Hitler's Germany during World War II, and we'll keep quiet about it if you will get all your business contacts in Central and South America. And remember, that's where a lot of the Germans who escaped during the rat lines wound up, in Argentina and Brazil. If you'll get them to change their votes in the UN, we'll keep quiet about what you did during World War II. And again, Nelson Rockefeller wound up a heartbeat away from becoming president of the United States. And so he did. David Ben-Gurion had to blackmail the U.S., or at least elements within it, and the Soviet Union to create the Jewish state in 1947 by a UN vote. But again, remember that world consensus after World War I was that it should happen. It's just that the UK and the United States started backing away from those promises in the 30s after oil was discovered under the sands of Arabia.
That's it's interesting to me. I don't know what I think of world consensus anymore. To be honest, I'm like, world consensus. I'm like, what is that? What does that even mean anymore?
Yeah.
Like world consensus. You think of the world consensus from a few years ago, and I would disagree vehemently with it. And yet that was world consensus. And if you were to write the history books here in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years to say that world consensus was 2020 was just a horrific year. It was just a horrific year. The world had never seen it before. I can just see how they're going to write it.
I agree.
And I could vomit on those pages. I just disagree vehemently with it.
The point though is that contrary to popular opinion, that the Zionists went into Palestine and forcibly, violently took the land away from peace-loving Arabs is a twisting of what actually happened. They worked through negotiations at least until 1947, when it became clear that that wasn't going to work anymore. They saw what kind of justice they were going to get after the Nuremberg trials, which were basically show trials.
Yes.
So they said, okay, well, we got to go the other way. And they went through the blackmail route to Stalin and Rockefeller to get the votes they needed for the UN to vote for this new state. But again, it's been that way since 1947. Again, I encourage people to read the book, The Secret War Against the Jews. If you think I'm just making things up to rationalize or justify a pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli worldview, I am not. I mean, I wear a tinfoil hat on the weekends so that you don't have to. And this is a view that I have come to after 20 years of researching and looking and disbelieving the official narrative. So,
that's why I have you on, though. I find it. I enjoyed our first chat, and the thing about what you've done and what you've been put through, and going on the app and all the different things. Once again, I push people to go back and listen to 701 because then they can hear all about it. Right? It's like. Mm-hmm. I sit there and you've said something that contradicts what I'm hearing in different circles, and so I'm like, that's fascinating because this isn't coming from, or at least I don't think it is, Derek, coming from like a quick off the hip. No, I'm pro this, pro that. It's like, well, no, you've been staring at this part of the world and geopolitics and news for the last 20 years. It's like it's very interesting because if I ask you other questions about different parts that I enjoy talking with you about, you've got a vast knowledge from a guy who's read a lot, talked to a lot of different people, and so it's just different. And I find different very interesting because the circles that there's two circles. There's obviously pro-Israel, and then there's pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas, and the two arguments. And I'm probably getting this wrong. But certainly, the pro-Israel is basically what you just said. And then the pro-Palestine is like, listen, they just killed like 15,000 people. What are we talking about here? It's genocide, and this needs to stop. And so they paint a picture of like how the Israelis are controlling the United States of America, among others. And I might point out, if they were that good at blackmailing the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the U.S. back then, they've only gotten better at it, I might add. Because if that's what they were founded on, you don't get founded on that and then not continue on with that being as successful as it is.
Yeah.
Regardless, it's an interesting point because those are the two sides of this coin. And for a long time, I don't talk about it because I'm like, I don't even know what I get to add to this. Like, I'm not there. I have no idea what to say, except it's starting the protests are bleeding out into all the world, right? Canada, we see all these protests and it's I don't even know. I think war in general is bad. Killing people in general is bad.
Agreed.
And I just don't know, like this Israel conflict is, I don't even know the word to associate to it other than what you said. It just, I'm like, huh.
It is a civilizational clash, and people who think that this began in 1947 or with the World Zionist Congress's first meeting in 1898 really need to go back a lot further to 632 AD with the death of Muhammad and his successors then choosing to export its religion at the point of a sword over the next century or so. 636 AD when his successor led the forces of Islam to victory over the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, at the Battle of Yarmouk, which then led to the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Antioch, the fall of Aleppo. The reason the Western world is called the West is because that's all that was left of Christendom after the first century of Islam. They conquered all of these ancient lands that had been Christian basically for centuries by the time of Islam's rise in the 7th century. All of North Africa, all of the Levant, most of Anatolia. I mean, they were at the gates of Constantinople in the 7th century. They crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and they conquered Spain in the 8th century. They were defeated. The only reason they didn't overrun all of France was that Charles Martel, king of the Franks, defeated them at the Battle of Tours in 736 AD. So within 100 years, they had overrun everything that had been Christian pretty much from what is now Israel to the English Channel practically. This is a civilizational struggle, and people who look at, say, the modern Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban and say, well, they're aberrations. That's not Islam. There are a lot of peace-loving Muslims. I get that. But when you go back to the fundamentals of that religion, it is a violent religion that has expanded by conquest for the last 1,400 years. And it is in the mindset of the religion and of Arabs in particular that once they controlled a land, which again they had control over the Holy Land, except for the brief century or two when the Crusaders had conquered it in the 11th and 12th centuries AD, they had controlled what is now Israel for the better part of 1,200 years. And so in their minds, it belongs to them. What I think is ironic about the Spanish government last year recognizing an independent Palestinian state. I mean, for one thing, it's hilarious that the diplomats that they've sent as envoys to the Palestinian government don't want to live in Ramallah because it's not safe and the internet's really bad. But secondly, that the Spanish don't know their own history because the Spanish for 700 years were under Muslim control. It was not a pleasant time for the Christians of Spain when they were under the control and governance of Muslims. And to the Muslim mind, that still belongs to them and they're going to take it back someday. I'm not exaggerating this. If you read legitimate, let's say, objective history of Islam, this is what the religion is about. I would recommend the book Sword and Scimitar by Raymond Ibrahim, which goes into this. And because he's Egyptian by ethnicity and can read and speak Arabic, he goes into original source material from Muslim historians who are writing about their battles with Christian armies at the time, which a lot of Christian historians don't have access to or don't bother to translate because it's difficult work. And but you get the sense coming away from the words of the Muslim historians writing about these battles themselves that this is a holy calling. And here we are in the 21st century, and this is what's behind the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. This is what's behind the conflict between groups like the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and groups that they come into contact with, not just Christians or Jews, but also Hindus and Buddhists. So this is a very old conflict that is still raging around the world. In fact, I wrote a book about this back in 2018, Bad Moon Rising. And I don't think it'll be resolved until the day that, Jesus returns at the head of the heavenly host.
When you look at North America, if we bring it back a little closer to home, and you see that, like how strong the United States has been for, 100 years. And, you go, some of these ideas that have snuck into our culture and they're just they make zero sense. You talk about how culture wars and tries to take over land and everything else. This is almost psychological, this psyop or whatever word you want to associate with it. Have you looked into, or I guess maybe just your thoughts on it, how it's slowly seeped into American culture, certainly Canadian culture, like with not only socialism, but just like just crazy ideas of, I guess in the extreme sense, like men being girls, or boys being girls, girls being boys, and just like this like, how did we ever get here? And yet this doesn't seem like it's by chance.
No, and I think it's funny because I hear myself saying things like what we're discussing today, and to think back 40 years when I came home from college after spending 4 years at a liberal arts college in downstate Illinois. Spent a semester studying in Chicago on an off-campus study program where we were exposed to a lot of ideas by urban organizers, civic organizers who were very liberal, far left. And I'd bring these ideas home to my mom and dad, and my dad would say, "You've been brainwashed." And I was, angry because I thought, age of 21, no, I'm smart. I'm an independent thinker. I know what I think. And now here I am, just turned 63, and I look back and it's like, yeah, Dad was right. He was talking about the dangers of communism when I was in college, just out of college 40 years ago. And I thought, Dad, the wall is down in Berlin. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Communism is so, last decade. But it really isn't. And these are the ideas that are behind some of these crazy things that have manifested over the last few years. Critical theory, which is fundamentally Marxist. It's behind what we in the U.S. have really been sensitive to over the last few years, critical race theory, but that's just a subset of critical theory. Marxist thought posits that there are always oppressors and the oppressed. So all political struggle is a ongoing battle between those who have power and those who are being abused by those who are in power. And there are various ways that this manifests. We're seeing it manifest as a struggle between those with less melanin and those with more melanin. And the less melanin you have, the more likely you are to be an oppressor. We see it in sexual gender identity. If you are heteronormative, you're an oppressor. If you're one of the less typical expressions of gender, you are of the oppressed class. But here's the thing: whenever the oppressors throw off the oppressed, when the working class throws off those with the money, they become the new oppressor. And then you've got a new oppressed class that has to rise up and throw them off. It is fundamentally chaotic. And Marx, whether he realized it or not, was being used by forces he probably didn't understand. And I'm talking spiritual forces now. He was openly, as Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis wrote in a book a couple of years ago, he was a Satanist. He was literally in league with the devil. And I don't just say that because, I happen to believe capitalism is the best economic system that's been developed. Yes, there are problems with capitalism because there are those who try to, take shortcuts and use it by breaking the law or whatever to oppress others. But that problem still exists whether it's a communist system, socialist system, whatever. The problem is not the system. The problem is that we humans, by default, tend to look out for ourselves at the expense of all others. So that is what is fundamentally behind some of these crazy ideas. This idea that I'm oppressed and therefore I need to rebel against your authority. It is fundamentally Marxist. And at the end of the day, Marxism is just chaos.
I got to ask, in all your years of podcasting, have you ever heard of a guy named Zachary King? I'm going to throw this out there again and just see if it sticks. No. Interesting. When you say Marx was a Satanist, is this something that you picked up on early on in the 20 years of starting to talk to people? Or is this something that's become more and more evident? Because it just feels like that's becoming a growing revelation of like, there's some people out there that are on the dark side of this that are really in the dark side.
No, I defer to Colonel McGinnis in his research. His book, Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism. And he went deep into it. So I was not aware of that. I knew that Marxist at the very least was an atheist, but Colonel McGinnis showed in his book that no, he was openly Marxist. Now, I know there are some, and this is really ironic, who believe that Marx, because he was Jewish, is part of this international Jewish conspiracy to control the world. But Marx wrote in the 1860s, when Jews in Europe were being oppressed, there were laws that were restricting what they could do, where they could work. They were really getting hammered in Russia. A lot of Russian Jews fled the country, especially after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, because one of the women involved in that plot had some Jewish ancestry. So they blamed it all on the Jews, and then Russia passed some laws that were intended to make Jews emigrate or starve. So that's why you got a lot of Jews emigrating to the U.S. and the U.K. in the latter part of the 19th century, and to what became Israel, the land of Palestine at the time. But Marx wrote that Jews who were protesting and wanting emancipation, they wanted to be free to live and work wherever they would. Marx wrote that the God of the Jew is money. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote in front of me, but that the emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of the world from Jews. He basically wanted Jews wiped out. So if Marx was a Jew and he was part of the international Jewish conspiracy, he hid it really, really well. But again, the book, Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism, Colonel McGinnis goes into Marx's true spiritual beliefs pretty deeply. And Bob is a really good researcher.
When you look at, multiple things heading our way in 2025, what do you think sticks out as like things people should pay attention to?
Central bank digital currency.
You think that's coming back around?
There are the two big economic blocks on planet Earth, the G7 and BRICS, are both launching pilot programs for central bank digital currencies in 2025. The G7 plan involves 40 of the world's top commercial banks. This is being led by the Bank for International Settlements, which helps reconcile transactions, basically facilitates international trade. Central banks that are part of this include the Bank of France, which represents the Euro system, the Bank of Japan, Bank of Korea, Bank of Mexico, Swiss National Bank, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, even though the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, says we're not anywhere near putting together a central bank digital currency, the New York branch of the Fed is taking part in this G7 program. Now, the BRICS nations are also setting up a pilot program. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus Iran, United Arab Emirates, and possibly Saudi Arabia. They've been invited, and they've kind of put their application on hold for now. But between India and China, you've got, about 3.5 billion people out of the 8 on planet Earth. And between Russia, Iran, the UAE, and especially if Saudi Arabia joins in, you've got something like 40% of the world's hydrocarbon reserves. So this is not small in terms of what they call purchasing power parity, how far the money will go. The G7 is now smaller than the BRICS nations. The BRICS have more buying power as a group than the G7, which is the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and there's one other that I'm leaving out, Canada, probably. So,
isn't that funny?
Yeah, the fact that
Canada's forgotten. About
America's
with
51st state. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
No, but so between the BRICS nations launching this program in 2025 and the G7 launching a pilot program in 2025, I think you've got two major organizations there, the bankers who want to make this happen. And the reason I think this is important is because unlike, say, Bitcoin, which is a decentralized digital currency, you've got all of these computers all around the world, not under the control of any one government or corporation or CEO, reconciling the transactions. And because of this, you more or less have financial privacy when you use Bitcoin to do something. A central bank digital currency, by definition, runs through a central bank. So if the Federal Reserve Bank or the Bank of Canada were to launch a digital currency, it would have a record of every financial transaction using that digital currency. So say if we got a digital dollar here in the United States and I wanted to go to the grocery store and buy ice cream, it's like, well, it could be programmed to connect it to, say, a China-like social credit score. Yes, your medical records indicate that your cholesterol is too high, Mr. Gilbert, so you can no longer buy ice cream until you bring your cholesterol back down below 200. We see that you're trying to buy some religious propaganda, a Bible or whatever. This is hate speech under the, blah, blah, blah regulation of 2025. And so therefore you cannot purchase this using a digital dollar. Or it could be geo-fenced so that your digital dollar could not be used outside of the boundaries of your 15-minute city into which they would like to herd all of us. As a resident in rural Missouri, our neighbors are mainly cattle and coyotes out here. I really don't want to move into a 15-minute city. I like living out here in the middle of no place.
So what you're saying is in 2025, you think, or not think, you're noticing that the CBDC conversation isn't dying down. It's only picking up steam. The fact that
it's
G7 and the BRICS nations are both going to do their own little pilot projects of it. It could be just not a blip on the radar, folks. I don't mean that as in like nothing big comes of it. It's actually quite a big thing what you're talking about. But in 2025, they could run a pilot project, and then it could ramp up 2026 or 2027 as they iron the kinks out, because they're signaling which direction they're heading. Yes?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. Now, again, Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, said we're not close to doing it. Donald Trump has said that as long as he's president, he would never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency. The House of Representatives here last year passed a bill barring the Fed from creating a digital dollar. But, Trump won't be president forever, contrary to what they might think on MSNBC. That may give us a 4-year window where we don't have to worry about it. But I think ultimately we're so used to using digital currency as it is. I mean, we use our credit cards, our debit cards. And again, Bitcoin is becoming more and more acceptable. Again, the fundamental difference between Bitcoin and a CBDC is that Bitcoin is decentralized and a CBDC is central is right there in the name. So it would be a government-controlled way. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing probably is lack of financial privacy. The government would know every single thing that you bought using a digital currency.
Anything else in 2025 you think is worthwhile of paying attention to? You mentioned a multitude of things there. The CBDC thing, the fact they're doing pilot projects on it should concern everybody, even though, you bring up Donald Trump and everything you just said. You go, yeah, so it's 4 years. And once upon a time, I went, 4 years, that's forever. Nothing's ever coming of it. Now I'm like, no, I mean, like 4 years is going to go by honestly faster than we think. And it's something to pay attention to. That's a long range worry or something to keep an eye on. Is there something more near term where you're like, you might want to watch this? They are pushing a whole bunch of diseases and trying to stir that back up again. I don't know if you have that in any of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's something that Sharon has been watching for a long time. When I first met her, because she's got a degree in molecular biology, and she is the smartest person I know. She's been tracking emerging diseases for decades. In fact, on our program, which we put on hiatus a couple of years ago, we used to do a weekly program called Sci Friday. And in January of 2020, we were talking about COVID-19 long before. I mean, it didn't even have a name at that point. We were still calling it the Wuhan flu. She noticed last year a story that really, I think, flew under the radar of most observers. And this was the amendments to the International Health Regulations. The International Health Regulations is an international treaty I think all but 5 nations on Earth have signed onto it, including the U.S., U.K., Canada. We're all parties to this treaty that the World Health Organization uses to govern its responses to public health emergencies. Well, these regulations were amended last year. And the way the amendments were worded essentially lays the groundwork for the World Health Organization. Excuse me, I've been doing a lot of talking on camera today. The World Health Organization to become a global government, because it allows the WHO to dictate to the signatories to this International Health Regulations Treaty how to respond to a public health emergency of international concern, or a PHEIC, PHEIC. But then they go on to define even things like misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation as a public health concern, referred to as an infodemic. So if something were to come around again, like we saw 5 years ago, we could conceivably see, or 4 years ago, we could conceivably see the World Health Organization step forward and say, you can't say this about that because this is misinformation. This is malinformation. And dictate to a member government, you need to go after Shaun Newman because he said this thing about this response to the public health emergency that is dangerous. He's contributing to an infodemic. So the question is whether governments would allow the WHO to dictate to it. Just because it's in writing doesn't mean the governments, if the WHO comes in and says, hey, United States, you've got too many batches of this vaccine. We want to send a bunch of these to sub-Saharan Africa. Will the U.S. say, yeah, fine, that's okay. We'll sacrifice some of our people so that you can save some people on another continent? Or would Donald Trump? Donald Trump has said he would like to pull out of the World Health Organization. Will he do it? I don't know. This may be another one of his opening moves to negotiate a better deal. But I think this is a question that will be probably answered in 2025 because, yes, there have been concerns about the avian flu out there. Sharon, in fact, wrote a novel 20 years ago about a weaponized form of avian flu. The novel, The Armageddon Strain, beautiful title. Will it become the next COVID-19? Don't know. We've only had one death to avian flu here in the United States, and that was a person in Louisiana. It was like 65 and had underlying health problems. So it is not there yet. There was a disease that popped up in Congo before the holidays that the Africa Center for Disease Control was calling Disease X, which was the term used for one of those tabletop exercises where they war gamed a response to a pandemic at Johns Hopkins University prior to COVID-19. So using the term Disease X, I think, was rather inflammatory and intentionally so to try to get people afraid. Disease X is here. There is no actual Disease X. That's a hypothetical disease that may emerge and become the next pandemic. But when that arrives, the World Health Organization is going to try to flex its muscle and tell global governments, UK, France, Russia, China, here's what you're going to have to do. Will they go along with it? Don't know. I kind of doubt it, but it is something to keep an eye on.
I have a hard time where we sit right now, how close we are to just coming out of all the mandates, all the lockdowns, everything. I just have a hard time believing the population, right? Like I get when a government comes down hard on people, right? But like here in North America, I just think there'd be a revolt. I can't imagine Americans doing that. I can't see it. And honestly, I know Canadians are billed as this peaceful nation, but we're getting pretty unruly here over the last 5 years. And if Justin Trudeau doesn't get out of the way, like, I don't know what would become of Canada. So like, to me, I just have the avian flu. I have a hard time with that one. I have a hard time. And maybe it's because it's too close to home with the COVID thing and everything they went there and did and locking down and everything else. I'm like, I have a hard time with that. There's other things like the CBDC thing. I'm like, oh, that's a trend. Even if it's a decade off, that's a trend we're heading closer to, not further away. We're not going to go away from using debit cards and credit cards and online sales and everything unless something cataclysmic happens. We're going to be going more and more into technology. AI isn't disappearing. It's growing, like it's constantly evolving and shifting. And, like I was listening to Rogan the other day, and he's talking about how, Chat GPT tried rewriting itself so it could save a copy of itself before it got erased for the new update. And I'm like, what? Like, is that where we're heading? We're going to head right into Terminator. Like we're on that trajectory, whether it's 100 years out or 500 or 20 years, it's those trends make sense to me. When you talk avian flu, I have a real hard time swallowing it, probably because where we just came out of.
You may be right, but my eyes are opened every time I go back to visit our daughter in St. Louis. And St. Louis is not one of the trendiest cities in America. She lives in a very hip area of the city, a recently gentrified area, kind of close into downtown. Here in the Ozarks, we're the joke is, welcome to the Ozarks, set your watch back 3 years. We are very conservative here. And in fact, we live in a county where the Democratic Party doesn't even bother to put up candidates for most of the county offices because there's no point. But when I go up to St. Louis to visit our daughter, it's really eye-opening. Say in 2022, when we in the Ozarks had basically dropped all of the lockdowns and the restrictions on restaurants and everything by pretty much the spring of the fall of 21 at the latest. I'd go up to St. Louis and I wanted to go to a local coffee shop and get coffee. It's like, oh, I left my mask at the hotel. I've got to go back to the hotel to get my mask so I can even go in this store. Still seeing people driving around St. Louis, in their cars alone with their masks on. So I think that that kind of attitude is much more prevalent on the coasts than even in the trendiest areas here in the center of the country. So you may see more of a fracturing of the conservative parts of Canada and the United States from the coastal elites, as it were. Here in the U.S., you got the Boston to Washington corridor. And on the West Coast, you got, L.A., San Francisco, and, Oregon and Washington, at least the parts along the coast that are very, very liberal. And if you look at a map of the way, on a county-by-county basis, the way things shook out in the last presidential election, a vast swath of, predominantly conservative voters in most of the rest of the country, with the exception of urban centers like Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and so on. So I think this is a longer term trend. This is not something that's going to happen in 2025, but I see long term a real difficulty for this country sticking together even by the end of this century. And I don't know if the same is true in Canada. I remember having conversations 30 years ago when I was selling steel pipe to guys up there at Fort McMurray that there were, it was very clear to me, and around Calgary, there were very strong opinions about what was coming out of Ottawa and how, Alberta
the
and
opinions
some of
have
the
only
Western
gotten
provinces,
stronger.
Yeah, would just as soon go their own way. So I'm only kind of half joking when President Trump says, Canada would be our 51st state. It's like, well, maybe parts of Canada would happily join the U.S., but only if we trade the West Coast. So I don't know. I don't know when you get so people who are so firmly entrenched in some of these worldviews that if you're a Trump voter, or if you're a voter for, say, the Conservative Party in Canada, you are so far right that people have a right to hit you, because your political views are not fit for public consumption anymore. How do you coexist with somebody like that?
What do you, if you were, we've talked about a plethora of things, right? From all over the, from the Middle East to, people have been listening. If you were looking at the next year and going, but here's what I'm positive on, there's something good going to happen this year. What trend or what thought, or is it Trump coming in, or is it a changing of the guard in politics or in media, or just, I'm curious. Once again, I think about it and I go, 20 years. 20 years is a long time to stare at the trends and start to see like how long it takes for things to shift and then maybe to get caught off guard and be like, oh man, I did not see that. Like we were talking about it, but how quickly certain things happened. When you look at 2025, is there anything you're like, I think people should pay attention to this because there's a possibility of a whatever, just the positive instead of the dark side of the world.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a good question because it's very easy to get caught in sort of a doom scrolling loop on social media and just look at all of these things and just assume that the sky is going to fall in. I don't think the end is just yet. The trends we're seeing towards more conservative populist political parties and candidates in the Western world, I think, is a good thing. In Europe, we're seeing it in France, Germany. The Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, is rising in the polls. We're seeing Reform UK with Nigel Farage at the head. I know I mispronounced his name. Farage, I guess. 12 years of French between high school and college, and that's the best.
That's the best you got.
Yeah. But Reform UK is doing well in the polls there because people have realized that Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour government are just an absolute disaster. But, Rishi Sunak and the Tories weren't any better. So we're seeing a trend back towards sanity and more conservative values. And I think people are saying, look, we are sick and tired of having to apologize for everything that our ancestors built. They weren't perfect. They were flawed. They did things that we have learned from and moved on from. But this direction that you want us to go is just a bridge too far. Men are men, women are women. And yes, we need to recognize the differences and celebrate those differences. I think there are some good things coming from this as we return to some more sensible outcome-based policies rather than policies that are put in place to give us a sense of self-satisfaction. We're seeing, sadly, how some of that is playing out in California, where we want to protect the environment by not clear-cutting, by not removing dead brush and removing dead trees from the forests.
This is exactly what happened to Jasper last year with the fire that almost knocked out Jasper, Alberta.
Right.
And when the further we dug into it, you realized that it was basically we weren't taking care of the forest. We weren't managing the forest, and a ton of deadfall over a period of time. And when it went. And so they've had a very dry summer and fall season in California, which California has had on repeated cycles for literally centuries. The fact is that California has had much bigger wildfires before white settlers moved in and started building massive cities across the landscape there. So it is something that could have been planned for, but in the interest of pretending to care about the environment, we're actually destroying the environment. So hopefully going forward, the policies will be more based on outcome rather than patting ourselves on the back. Look, aren't we great? We've saved the snail darter or whatever. California, I pray for the farmers there. I pray that they will allow the farmers to start watering their crops again. Pray that they will have the sense to start building the reservoirs to hold the snow melt. And when they do get those spring rains, to have that water available later in the year when it's needed, like now. So I think there's some good things that are coming there. And I think the way the Middle East has been reshaped, there is an opportunity there for some peace anyway. I think there's been some encouraging signs. The Abraham Accords that were put forward under the first Trump administration, again, even if it's just marriages of convenience where the Saudis want to make nice with the Israelis to give them some additional leverage against the Iranians. There's some indication that the Persians, the Iranian people,
are ready to throw off the theocracy that they've been living under since 1979. And that would be a good thing, because that is a very ancient and proud people with a lot of natural resources there. They could be doing a lot better economically if they weren't organizing their country on the basis of a very restrictive and dictatorial religion. So I think there's some good things coming. We're seeing a swing back towards conservative values, and I don't say that just because of a preference for those as I get older. I just see that people who tend to be conservative in their worldview look
I think a
more
lot
at,
of people are just, it's a swing back to common sense.
Common sense,
right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, Derek, appreciate you giving me some time today. It's me today that has a time constraint, and I'm looking at the clock, and I gotta go pick kids up, and that normally doesn't happen Derek was kind enough to hop on a touch early so that we could squeeze this in. But appreciate you coming on. All the best in 2025, and we'll look forward to watching what you guys do next on your side. All the best, and thanks for giving me some time today.
You bet. Honored to do it.